Hello all. Glad you're joining us. As soon as my speakers, oh yep, there we go. As soon as my speakers arrive, if you could leave your little raise hand emoji, I will promote you to a panelist. You'll be able to speak. Oh, Mindi, that's what I'm looking for, right? There we go. All right, I'll make you a panelist too. All right. And as people start to trickle in any of my other speakers, if you could use your raise hand emoji, that would be great.
Thanks for the discussion on Avatar. Mindi, it's a good thing that you missed the last presentation because you haven't finished the series yet and yet lots of spoilers.
Oh, I've been kind of spoiled anyway, but thank you. I'm sad though that I've missed so much because I really wanted to come this weekend and then other things have happened. But I'm really excited for the other person who's speaking in our time because this is one of my favorite books and I'm really excited to hear about that. So.
Well, it's not a book I'm familiar with at all, so I'm looking forward to learning about it.
Yeah, I have my copy, and Amal signed it too, so I'm really.
I'm familiar with his
Max's
short story, The Secrets of Owls, I think it's called. That was really good.
Okay, got my moderator. Awesome. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, how you doing?
All right. So everybody's aware, the recording is already going, just so I don't mess that one up again. So there you go.
Do you want me to do a recording of my response so that you can put it up with Aaron's?
Maybe we'll ask Daniel about the best way to handle that. I do apologize, but
okay.
this one's going already, so we'll trim it down as opposed to the other way around. Thanks so much.
Cindy, I really appreciated your response to the last talk. I thought it was really, really good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really fun getting to do that. I was unfamiliar with Avatar before these talks were announced.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I watched it when it was first on the air, and not Korra though. I wasn't able to watch Korra when it was first on the air, but and it's something that I've enjoyed sharing with my kids, and so something that kind of has some long-term resonance. So it was a couple of very, very good talks, and the breakout session was wonderful.
Oh, good. It was a long Q&A, but yeah, we got some good questions. I'm seeing 3 speakers right now. Are there going to be 2 speakers for both talks? Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure for my introductions. Okay.
Hang on, my co-speaker is struggling to find the right link. Let me.
I think I'm putting something in the chat. I think this is right.
Okay. Sorry about this.
Okay. There was a question in the chat, where will all the YouTube vids and recordings go? Can we rewatch that talk on Dune 10 times more, possibly? Actually, last night when we did that talk, I believe it was recorded directly to YouTube, and I know that we're working on editing it right now. So I do know that that talk is going to be available. In the past, we've put it on the Doxacon website, so it should be available soon on the Doxacon website. All right, it looks like we've got everybody here now.
Oh, yay. Oh, thank God. Okay.
Yes, he's here. Okay, so we will get started. And, you know, we're only running 2 minutes late, so that's great. For session 3, we have 4 speakers in 2 talks, meaning I hope that we will have a very lively Q&A. So don't forget once again to ask those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our first talk is Action and Mimesis in This Is How You Lose the Time War. Our speakers, Anne M. Carpenter and Lyle Enright, intend to mimic the epistolary form of this recent novel during their talk, focusing largely on the 2 main characters, and here's a quote from their blurb, co-creation of the possibility of one another, their conspiracy of relating to each other. I'm not familiar with this novel. I believe it only came out in about 2019, but now, you know, based upon the fact that it's an epistolary novel, et cetera, it makes me really want to go and read it, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. Anne M. Carpenter is an associate professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. Mary's College of California. She has written on theological aesthetics, including the book Theopoetics. She often combines technical metaphysics and artistic endeavor, and lately her focus has been on early 20th century French Catholics in preparation for her upcoming book, which is a theory of tradition. She has poetry in Macrina magazine and loves comic books as much as she loves poetry. And we were just talking about comic books in a breakout. Lyle Enright is a Cleveland-based writer and independent scholar. He regularly publishes on religious themes in contemporary art and culture. You can also find his poetry and short fiction in journals such as The Cresset, Fathom, Short Edition, Speculative City, or through TLDR Press, where he is a contributing editor. Lyle holds a doctorate in English from Loyola University, Chicago, and currently serves as lead writer and chief story officer for Unrivaled Network. Anne and Lyle.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just begin. Dear Lyle, what makes a first word? I don't mean what is a first word. I mean very precisely what makes a first word. What are its conditions of possibility? What brings this possibility into act? And what is the possibility that it makes possible with its actuality? Beginning is a problem, says Hans von Balthasar, and such a problem it is. How do I begin to begin? What do I do when I break my silence with a word? When I greet an enemy's glittering eyes? When I say, burn before reading? What, Lyle, in all of space and time, is this first word, this primal decision? This Is How You Lose the Time War is very much a story about the making of a first word, or many words, as it happens, or seems to, as two time-traveling enemies braid and unbraid strands of time, or it's probably better to say strands of times, of many timelines imagined as complex knotted flows. Red and blue, their names, as it happens or seems to, act in order to undo one another. And in the absolutist sense, they seek to unfasten the future that makes the other person at all. So red and blue wander through wild and varied spaces and their times to discover their present project ruined by the other one, a ruin noted by a letter, which takes one ingenious form or another. But very quickly, this more tightly wound tete-a-tete loosens. Sometimes their paths do not touch at all, nor are they foiled, but they intersect across some daring feat of time. Here are blue's words riddled carefully in the rings of a tree, which red someday cuts down and reads with deliberate fingers. It is a story of time travel. And so it is hard to say when the first word is, nor whose, nor how exactly it was made, at least if how has to be chronological. Even that first letter, burned before reading, conflates modes of time. I love this about red and blue. I love that their genders, something like a woman, as much as their temporalities, are only partly legible, since their time-skipping bodies can become so many things, indeed whatever their side in the war needs. I love that their names to one another bleed into dozens of synonyms for red, for blue, but also bleed into just one, this person, you. Augustine might understand. There's that dizzying moment in his Confessions where he at last no longer remembers, where the narrative arc drops out. That sense of passing time evaporates. Now we've caught up to Augustine's now, and we read suddenly a direct address. May I know you who know me. Thus are we made interlopers in an intimacy, a conversation right now between this man and God, between an I and a you. And even if, in all books previous, Augustine pauses to address God rather often, still this word is new, because this word hangs differently temporally. Balthasar might say that this difference is an expression of time's verticality, which intersects with horizontal or chronological time. It is his way of saying that human beings change not only temporally. Here I think of that Western medieval idea where knowledge changes the knower. In the medieval world, this is what it means to know at all, to be someone different. Thus Aristotle says, the soul is in a way all things. It is not just that today is not yesterday, which makes me different. It is that I am someone different. What in me changes, Lyle? After all, for me to speak a word to you, to suppose a word for you, to suppose myself in my speaking to you. I do not know what roads lead forward, says Red in a letter, but your letter hungers for reply. I pour you into things. I like writing you. I like reading you. When I finish your letters, I spend frantic hours in secret composing my replies, pondering ways to send them. Do you and I, Lyle, overwhelm time and one another, if only for a moment? Are we changed in some way that laughs at before and after, that is dangerous and necessary when we speak, when we intend with our speaking? Are our listeners here also changed? Language, Balthasar argues, must flow away. syllable by syllable, until the meaning of what is said, distilled like an essence out of what has vanished, can be understood by the listener. Or as Red says, I have built a you within me, or you have. I wonder what of me there is in you. Here's where someone like Balthazar wants to make a theological gesture. And maybe in Red and Blue, we can get at something Balthazar means with his theology. He says, after all, that the breaking apart of human beings against one another's fists breaks God's heart. For the divine word of the Father that speaks humanity into existence desires our existence. The Trinity has, since eternity, built an us within itself. For Balthazar, this divine intention is what we suppose in our own supposing, in our own intending and its speaking. The meanness that I know as pure, inescapable self, says Blue, is hunger. It is difficult, it is very difficult to befriend or you wish to consume, to find those who, when they ask, do I have you still, when they end a letter with yours, mean it in any substantive way. Lyle, do I have you still?
My Anne, who has me. In asking for the first word, its pieces, its possibility, you sidled me with the second, and with it a precedent. Hunger, you've called yourself your pure, inescapable self, and made yourself mine, which is to say, you've made me hunger. I've licked your word from the inside of my cheek. My teeth long to press the answer to your question, what makes a first word? How should I know, is my answer. And please come back to the page and sit with me again, because I know you know me to be better than flippant. I sincerely mean how, by what means, what method, should, under what imperative, what urgent rhythm of breath and limb. I know. When Blue makes tea for Red to drink, she knows what goes into the making, the leaves chosen for scent, for stinging and soothing the tongue at a particular temperature. Red can only speculate at these decisions, can only trust that the experience is curated to stoke grateful, earnest yearning from her at 134 degrees. Red, too, knew how to eat, to taste, before Blue taught her how to hunger, to sate or to stoke, wetting itself on what you fed it. Here again is this ambivalent you, as Blue could mean anyone in the possible worlds when she says it, and yet by now Red knows that the you becomes an I in her own furnace between her own teeth, wetted itself on what I fed you, Blue might as well have said, because she is the one teaching Red how she should know hunger. And how ought I to speculate so that I may know? I am hungry and know how to eat, but how might I taste in order to see? I ask because my first instinct was to answer you. In answering, I would have made the first word, and your first what would become a question to an answer I knew. Isn't this precisely the glitter in an enemy's eyes? How does one begin this sort of thing? Red asks of something she did not begin, because she is already formed by the insidious Blue, no matter where and when she braids herself in relation to her romantic little joke. I could have pretended to be someone who could answer and so seize the first word from you, as Red attempts to do, and we would have both told ourselves what René Girard calls the romantic lie, that I am the source of my own desire, that your obliteration would not affect me in the least. It would, of course. It's wrong to call you an enemy. Red learns this in the hardest way, because upon losing Blue, who dies for her sake, she is unmade all the same. Not content to have her memory, her rival, to dance again as enemies after living and loving and letting be, she descends, ascends, traverses, the innumerable braids gathering pieces of Blue into her. She carries them back to a time before either of them were so that they may be born again, confirms what both of them have known for a long time. that they have been inside one another since the beginning, constituting one another. Red seeds blue with the very hunger she learned from blue before blue was ever born. Even when they were rivals, they had already co-created one another. In light of this recursion, how do we go about asking for this first word? It is, I think, like asking after the first desire, the original archaic yearning that patterns all that comes after. Yet what a thing to ask for we know that desire is not original, not an arche, nor is any word spoken without the implication of another word going before it. The first word is always already an answer, even to a listening silence. Mustn't time be overwhelmed then? Isn't Balthazar so thoroughly right in this case to gesture Godward? Who could speak of a first word, a first desire in the triune life of God? The word first only makes sense if there is, miracle of miracles, anything that is not God. A spoken desire that there should be other. Before any sequence, any start to anything, there must be the desire for the other's desire to live. So then, I want you to live is the first word, and the second is like it. If desire for the other is what makes the first word, then it also precedes every enmity. And enmity can only be a negation of this desire, a starving denial, a refusal to taste or to see. Yet we are so trapped within this deformity. So strange is this desire that there be other than myself, that I cannot experience it otherwise than as enemy action, as this vertical lance, this piercing of time, this spasm of revelation that shows me my hunger, my own hunger, mine, beginning before and without me. Is this perhaps the way we experience grace's perfection of nature as true diachronicity, an opening of a possibility ever latent but impossible to imagine with the means at hand? The possibility that we would unmake the enemy addressed by our first word, that the enemy would let themselves be unmade as enemy. This is what we call God. Not a possible God or a God of perhaps, but the actual behind the possibility of saving one another, of not giving a shit who wins this war, behind the whatever of the arc of the universe. It is the real behind every possible you and every stardust of me. And it is how we win, Anne, you and me. This is how we win.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I have a lot of thoughts that are going through my head right now, and I'm hoping that we can have an opportunity to, untangle some of those thoughts during the Q&A. Our second talk is titled Hopepunk Theology, Weaponizing Optimism in Resistance to a Grimdark World. The Hopepunk ethos, as our speakers tell us, centers kindness and also resistance to empire as not just a political, but a moral imperative. This talk will examine how this Hopepunk ethos embodied in ancient and contemporary religious leaders intersects with stories found in scripture and pop culture. Our speakers are Reverend Mindi Welton-Mitchell, pastor of Queen Anne Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington, and Reverend Paul Schneider, pastor of Berean Community Church in Berean, Washington. Beyond her work as pastor, Reverend Mindi writes science fiction under the name Melinda Mitchell. Her first novel, Next of Kin, retells the story of the biblical Ruth as a fast-paced space adventure, which I'm going to have to read because Ruth is my patron saint. Her short fiction debut, Space Force Chaplain, will appear in Tales from the Space Force. She blogs weekly at Revolution. Reverend Paul Schneider, a graduate of the Berkeley School of Theology, is a lifelong fan of science fiction and fantasy across many types of media. He has also been playing all kinds of games, especially tabletop RPGs, as both player and storyteller since grade school. Reverends Mindi and Paul.
I just have to say one quick thing. Unfortunately, my book, Next of Kin, the publisher fell victim to COVID, as did a lot of publishing companies, small presses, and my book is not being published at this time. So that's the sad note. But the positive note is my short story, Space Force Chaplain. I just saw the past pages for it this week. So it will be out and before the end of the year. Paul, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. So on Tumblr in 2017, Alexandra Rowland posted, "The opposite of Grimdark is Hopepunk. Pass it on." The author was drawing attention to the genre of Grimdark and pointing out the necessity to have a counterbalance to that narrative of selfishness and hopelessness. Hopepunk is more than just two conjoined words. It's a naming of a type of story that exists in fiction and history, in mythology, and in our society. Later, Rowland defined the term and listed fictional characters and real people who were considered Hopepunk. As Baptist pastors, our attention was piqued when we saw that Jesus Christ and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were on that list.
So before we get to Hopepunk, it's helpful for us to consider previous works on theology and media. Anthony Bartlett, in his work Virtually Christian, How Christ Changes Human Meaning and Makes Creation New, explores the work of the cross in cinema and popular music through the lens of nonviolent atonement and the work of René Girard. And we just heard a little bit about mimetics in the last presentation. Bartlett argues that it is not possible to see the signs of the cross in the media without the work of the cross. We cannot view film and literature representations of sacrifice to save others without thinking of Jesus on the cross. Bartlett's work leads us to Hopepunk theology. However, while Bartlett takes on Girard's view through nonviolence, Hopepunk is focused on resistance through weaponized optimism. The language of violence is transformed into a language of resistance, similar to the armor of God found in Ephesians chapter 6. Hopepunk theology builds on this previous work. The genre of Hopepunk itself is not without violence, but Hopepunk theology is built on the force of optimism and hope that comes from the work of Jesus, and the signs we see in cinema and literature of this genre of the cross and resistance. In the words of a colleague of mine, Reverend Rebecca Sumner, we find Easter eggs all around. And as you probably know, Easter eggs are a term used in media to refer to hidden messages, clues, or inside jokes that the viewer will understand if they've read or seen more in that genre. In this case, for us, the Easter egg is the Easter story, as well as the gospel and resistance.
In order to understand Hopepunk, it's necessary to define both Grimdark and the many punk genres. Particularly since 2001, Grimdark storytelling has increased, though Grimdark certainly existed before that. The Grimdark premise is that human nature is essentially bad. People are selfish and more likely to do terrible things that advance personal goals than to help others. Grimdark settings are dangerous. Hope is lost, violent and disturbing actions are common and presented in excruciating detail. Dystopian stories where survivors live in the ashes of fallen civilizations, oppressed by a powerful few with little chance of improvement, are not just in young adult fiction. You see them in media aimed at people of all ages. These stories are a reaction to our own world. From the horrors of Myanmar to the resurgence of white nationalism at home and abroad, and the violent insurrection in the U.S. Capitol in January, you can see why our world is perceived as grimdark. In a grimdark world, things do not get better, only worse. People will always make selfish decisions, and systems and structures will continually fail us. Cyberpunk came into being in the late 1970s. The term comes from a vision of the future where technology is a defining feature of human life, combined with the ideals of the punk movement. The punk movement is all about resistance, both of cultural norms and the oppression of governments and societies against marginalized people. Punks are effective activists, putting their message in distinctive music and personal style and matching it with social and political action. Cyberpunk futures are dystopian settings ruled by corporations where the wealth gap between the poor and the rich is unbridgeable, and while technology might improve lives, it's also used to quiet the populace and ensure corporate profits. The will of the corporations is enforced by mercenaries and corrupt politicians. The protagonists of the stories are where the punk comes in. They resist these systems directly and indirectly. William Gibson, the first writer to have the label cyberpunk on his work, no longer lets his work be called science fiction or cyberpunk. The reality of today is well on its way to being the world he wrote about. Because of the popularity of cyberpunk, though, several other punk genres have arisen. Some defined by cultures or people groups, as in Afropunk, others by a broader ethos or focus, such as ecopunk and solarpunk. Still others imagine worlds with a different technological focus, like steampunk or dieselpunk. One criticism of these terms is that they're descriptors of aspects of the settings, and the ideal of resistance to the dominant paradigm is not part of these stories. Resistance is central to the punk culture's ethos, so it's a valid point that the punk label may be misapplied to these stories. That criticism is also leveled against Hopepunk. However, resistance is at the core of Hopepunk. Hopepunk says that kindness and softness don't equal weakness, and that in this world of brutal cynicism and nihilism, being kind is a political act, an act of rebellion. Characteristics notable in the Hopepunk genre are gentleness and kindness, the struggle to build positive social systems, community building through cooperation, not conflict, self-awareness of emotion, showing vulnerability is accepted and encouraged, and that anything worth fighting for is worth sacrificing for. There's not usually a happy ending, but rather an understanding that the struggle will always exist, and the courage to continue anyway. Hopepunk is the opposite of Grimdark because it stands for resisting hopeless paradigms and valuing humanity. Another criticism of Hopepunk is that it's just wholesome. Fred Rogers, the Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, stood for kindness, love, learning, hope, and growing as a person. His work inspired generations of children, including both of us. Mr. Rogers believed that gentleness and kindness were the right choice, but he also stood up to the powerful in order to benefit the least, especially children, in his testimony before Congress about funding for public broadcasting. Fred Rogers is a real-world Hopepunk figure, but Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood isn't Hopepunk. The show deliberately excluded darker things in order to create a comfortable space for the children watching. Hopepunk actions and stories don't happen in comfortable spaces. On the other hand, the fictional Steve Rogers, Captain America, epitomizes Hopepunk in the MCU. In Captain America: The First Avengers, young Steve Rogers is a small man who refuses to back down even when overmatched, because, as he says, I don't like bullies. He's transformed to where his physical power matches his moral strength, but doesn't lose any of the kindness or courage that defined him. He fights against the Nazis, especially the Red Skull, to take out the leadership of Hydra, and then is frozen for decades as a result of a brave and self-sacrificing act. When he returns to our modern world, he's a hero a step out of time. In the sequel, Captain America: The Winter Soldier, Steve Rogers learns that though he cut off the head of Hydra, true to its name, it sprouted more heads. Hydra has become a cancer across the world, especially in the US government. S.H.I.E.L.D., the very agency meant to protect the world from Hydra, has instead become the eyes, ears, and hands of the monster. With all the odds against Captain America and his allies, and Hydra poised to claim its ultimate victory, this Mr. Rogers delivers a compelling speech, inspiring S.H.I.E.L.D. agents not in Hydra to stand against their fellows in order to save the world. He warns that Hydra has infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. and has nearly total control, and will soon have the power to kill anyone in their way. He says, unless we stop them. I know I'm asking a lot, but the price of freedom is high. It always has been, and it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not. In the end, it's not just Captain America resisting Hydra, but also those S.H.I.E.L.D. agents who won't lie down and let Hydra dominate the world, even at the cost of their lives. Hopepunk requires the shadow of a grimdark world, needs something to resist in order to be Hopepunk. Hopepunk is not utopia. Using broadly Christian ideas, we could say that with a Hopepunk mentality, the kingdom is already and not yet. It's already present in acts of kindness and resistance to evil and empire. It's not yet present in that the world is still a flawed and broken place where terrible things happen. The act of resistance, of striving to create that better world, even though it will never be a perfect world, is at the heart of Hopepunk stories. Because a significant measure of utopia has been achieved in its universe, most of Star Trek is not Hopepunk, but Star Wars usually is. The recent trilogy of Star Wars movies showing that even after overcoming the evil empire, there's no happily ever after for the characters or their universe.
We do have an exception of that with Picard, which we can talk about in the Q&A. While Hopepunk is a reaction of our times, and there was an article that just came out yesterday about Hopepunk from the author Ada Palmer, and she writes about how this is a reaction since 2016 specifically. But we find the roots of Hopepunk in our scripture. Indeed, most of the authors who blog about Hopepunk, as we shared before, mention Jesus, whether they are Christian or not, and they cite the work of Martin Luther King Jr. as in the line of Hopepunk. To summarize the roots of Hopepunk in Scripture, we have focused on 3 stories: Jeremiah's role before the fall of Jerusalem, Jesus' death and resurrection, and the beginning of the early church in Acts. One of the themes of Hopepunk is resistance to empire, and we could write an entire paper on Hopepunk and Revelation, but we instead chose to narrow our focus on resistance to empire when all hope seems lost in the story of Jeremiah. When the prophet was a young boy, God spoke to him and said, "See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant." And that's from Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10. From the beginning, Jeremiah's role was to speak on behalf of God to the empires of the world, that they would fall, and often in bleak, grimdark terms. The prophet was even locked up in the stocks for prophesying against his own king. He prophesies on the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, and in the middle of that battle, when all hope seems lost, God tells Jeremiah to buy a field. Even though the enemy is upon them, the empire has come, Jeremiah buys a field from his cousin, signs the deed, has it sealed and tucked away in a safe place, because the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, has said, "Houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land." And that's in chapter 32. Jeremiah speaks to a resurrection hope, that the worst thing that happens to his people in that time was not the last thing. God would bring them out of exile, and in the following verses, Jeremiah recalls how God delivered the people from Egypt. We know that the kings and the officials didn't listen to Jeremiah. Those who fought back were killed, and the leaders didn't turn from their ways. However, we also know that a few generations later, some of the exiles did return, the hope fulfilled. The parallel story for Jeremiah in recent fiction of an empire utterly crushing a rebellion and forcing some of its own prophets to go into exile is Star Wars, and specifically Rogue One. The Jedi have gone into exile with the rise of Darth Vader. The Emperor's Death Star is about to wreak havoc on the galaxy. While the famous saying from this movie is, "Rebellions are built on hope," the rebellion at this point is not about a violent revolution to save the people, but a last desperate attempt for a future hope. The plans for the Death Star to stop the weapon of mass destruction, to the point that Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor sacrificed their own lives to save the rest of the galaxy. Jeremiah himself did not live to see the remnant return, nor did Jyn and Cassian know for certain that their attempt to transmit the plans of the weakness in the Death Star made it to the Alliance. However, Jeremiah lived with the assurance that God's promise in chapter 29, verse 11, of a future with hope would be fulfilled. At the end of Rogue One, the expressions on the faces of Jyn and Cassian before the shockwave from the Death Star blast hits them convey satisfaction, a hope that is lived, that the worst of the Empire would not have the final word. And due to time, I'm going to skip. We had a brighter example from Guardians of the Galaxy, but we are going to run out of time if I go with that. So another theme that emerges in the resistance to empire is the theme that death does not have the final word, as we said. As shared in the example of Rogue One, the willingness to lay down one's life for the greater good is a common theme of Hopepunk and, of course, central to the gospel of Jesus. Jesus' death and resurrection defies the weapon of choice of the Roman Empire, the cross of crucifixion, and utterly turns it into a symbol of hope and resistance to empire. N.K. Jemison's The Broken Earth trilogy, beginning with the 5th season, is a heartbreaking story of resistance to an empire that has enslaved those who are different, those who possess the power of orogeny to quell earthquakes and volcanoes or cause them. The story begins with the ending of the empire, and in turn, the ending of the world, with one person rebelling against this injustice, causing a geological disaster of epic proportions. However, it turns out that the world can still be saved, but not without sacrifice. As Mary watched her only son upon the cross, who gives of himself to save the world, in the Broken Earth series, it is a mother who sacrifices herself in the very work of orogeny, the power that she has been forced to use for the empire so that her daughter can save the world. In the final scenes, a son, the mother, has become a new creation, but it turns out that the new creation is very much rooted in who her people used to be, returning to her created intention. A final theme we want to focus on is that the crux of Hopepunk theology and scripture is weaponizing optimism. We find that the Acts of the Apostles is a particularly upbeat book of the Bible, despite the martyrdom of many early Christian leaders in Paul's imprisonment. When Stephen is about to be stoned in Acts chapter 8, he cries out a message of hope. "Look, I have seen the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." Stephen never renounces his belief in Christ, even at the point of death, and right after this chapter, as you well know, is the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Both Peter and Paul face imprisonment, threats against their lives, violence, rejection, even at times divisions among themselves. However, the writer of Acts continues to keep hope alive with an optimistic tone, and the message is repeated over and over again, first by Peter and then by Paul, is that Jesus, who was killed, will rise again. Even when they are in prison, their jailers hear this message and believe. This optimism, this hope, cannot be stopped in the early church. This weaponized optimism defies death and imprisonment, evil and empire. Oscar-winning director Guillermo del Toro writes that optimism is radical. It is the hard choice, the brave choice. And it is, it seems to me, most needed now. History and fable have both proven that nothing is entirely lost. David can take on Goliath. A beach in Normandy can turn the tide of war. Bravery can topple the powerful. These facts are often seen as exceptional, but they are not. Every day we become the balance of our choices between love and fear, belief or despair. No hope is ever too small. Acts of the Apostles shows us that the marginalization of others is the work of the empire, and to resist empire is to resist oppression and marginalization. Priscilla, Lydia, Damaris, and Dorcas, also known as Tabitha and given the title disciple, are all leaders in the early church. The Ethiopian eunuch, baptized by Philip, was both an ethnic and sexual minority who would have been barred from temple worship. Peter's own vision of inclusion for the centurion Cornelius broke open the dividing walls for all Gentiles. The gospel continues to be shared with hope despite the persecution the early church faced. We see this weaponized optimism and work of inclusion in another Star Wars film, The Last Jedi. There was much resistance to this film, both in its message of hope and its diverse cast, by those who stated that the message of The Last Jedi was too weak, too feminine, too focused on love. A blog post on Canada Press states that Hopepunk contains a weaponized aesthetic of softness, wholesome, or cuteness, and maybe a temper of consciously chosen gentleness. The Last Jedi had porgs, if you remember the cute little bird-like creature, and Luke Skywalker, the former Jedi Knight, drinking milk right from the breast of a creature, and Rose Tico, a new character with the quote of the movie, "We're going to win this war not by fighting what we hate, but by saving what we love." Luke Skywalker wins the battle in the end by not fighting at all. And due to time, Paul, I am going to just skip ahead to your last piece, because we are almost out of time.
Hopepunk may have been named now, but has existed since the beginning. Like Tabitha being the first woman called a disciple, but women before her were certainly also disciples. In some ways, Hopepunk is almost too broad a definition. The question is asked in several of the articles that we read, but isn't everything Hopepunk? One could say the same thing of the gospel, but isn't everything good news? Doesn't all of creation speak to us of the goodness of our God? Hopepunk stories existed before the term was coined, but the fact that they are becoming more prominent now speaks to what people today are reacting against. Andrew Slack, comedian, activist, and founder of the Harry Potter Alliance, framed it this way when pointing to the successes his organization had. The truly radical thing we've done is show that fantasy is not an escape from the world, but an invitation to go deeper into it. By encouraging young people to be like the heroes they read about, this enthusiastic generation really can change the world. Likewise, in the shadow of the aftermath of the seditious riot in our capital during the inauguration, Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, was Hopepunk articulated, reminding us that the light is always there if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it. What is Hopepunk theology then? Hopepunk theology is weaponized optimism to resist empire. Hopepunk is not utopia. Hopepunk is the already not yet of the kingdom, the beloved community, the reign of God. We see, experience, and participate in the reign of God, but we know that the fruition is still to come. Even though the empire has us surrounded, we resist, not with violence, but with hope. We resist with love. We resist with gentleness and kindness, the fruits of the Spirit. We resist empire by rejecting toxic masculinity, choosing a Savior who told his disciples to put away the sword, who went willingly to the cross, who chose death as resistance rather than violence. In Jesus' death, he saved those he loved, all of us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that talk, and I have questions for both sets of speakers, but we also do have a question already in the chat, in the Q&A. I'll come back to that in just a little bit because I do want to at least, it's kind of an unformed question. It's more like a few musings in relation to the first talk. And I think we're going to have a lot of questions in terms of the Grimdark and Hopepunk. So I'd like to kind of articulate some of my musings on the first talk and see what our speakers have to say. First of all, by the red and blue and their paralleling of each other, their mirroring, I hope I'm using this right. It's been decades since I've dealt with mimetic theory, but I'm getting the impression that they're kind of mirroring each other and that there's an interconnectedness between them, which is very near to the hearts of Orthodox Christians, which is, you know, the idea that we are all interconnected through Christ. But I was thinking, as you were talking about red and blue, about the old game Myst, which I don't know if you've ever played it, but the paper, the colors of paper that these two brothers who are mirrors of each other are red and blue. One of them has blue pages, the other has red pages, and they are enemies. These are enemies seeking escape from imprisonment. And I'm just kind of, you know, wondering if you can articulate you did such a wonderful job in articulating everything in a poetic fashion. I'm wondering if you can articulate in a discursive fashion some of these ideas about mimesis and interconnectedness and the relationship of enemies and so on.
I'll take a stab to start.
Okay.
The mimetic component is kind of my I guess my contribution to a little background. Like Anne invited me to read this book with her, and it provoked just this constant back and forth of what was going on. And I was reading it largely from the lens of mimetic theory, while she was reading from Balthazar and Blondel, and in the kind of sense of where does action come from? What leads people to do things in the first place? So this question has really driven me the whole time we read together, of the interplay between these two characters and the way they co-create one another, not from a point in time, but it's the discovery that they make that they have always been part of one another in a way that transcends time, which is a very Girardian insight about the nature of humanity. But Girard starts from this idea that because we imagine ourselves to be the sources of our own desire, the sources of our own identity, the person outside of me becomes a threat. And that's very much the premise that they're rivalry, their enmity is based on, is they each belong to a superstructure, an organization that has them set as agents in these different timelines, trying to create a kind of perfect version of the universe. And these two organizations have two very different ideas of what the universe should look like. So their success in the organization's mind depends on the obliteration of this other organization so that it cannot bring its timeline to pass, right? Again, we see this theme of a need for the other to disappear in order for me to assert my identity as I understand it. Of course, the discovery that gets made here is that I am not who I am without the other who is participating in me and making me. In fact, as you were asking your question, I went back to the book and tried to find the one time that the word purple appears in the entire text. it's when one of them, actually, who is it? It's Red who says my prose purples. So that of her language, of their language, it's this interesting moment. The only time you get the word purple where it's through language that they recognize themselves as intermingling. And there's this new reality that's emerging as they interact and interplay with one another, and they realize there is no possible world in which I am not made less by your disappearance, your obliteration, something that's been articulated beautifully very recently in Judith Butler's new book, The Force of Nonviolence, which relates to our second talk as well. That language of my language, the end, the desire for the other's desire to live comes from Butler. And I think it encapsulates a lot of Red and Blue's arc through this as well.
I was thinking as you were talking that this subversion of the enmity, of the need to negate the other, does dovetail nicely into the Hopepunk ethos, which, you know, is less about destruction and you know, more moving in a hopeful direction. I do want to get a little bit into.
I think Anne wanted to add something to.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I wanted to add some Balthazar and.
Okay.
So relying on people like Irenaeus, Balthazar will emphasize that the work of redemption relies on a human solidarity that already exists. So I think Christians tend to sprint straight to the body of Christ, but the work of redemption relies on something already extant. That's the whole logic of God for Irenaeus. And so for someone like Balthazar, speaking theologically about redemption, there's sort of two necessary elements. One is that I am not God. And so God actually acts in that I am not to redeem me. And there's a price to pay. And I think Red and Blue actually have to let go of a lot. Blue dies straight up after swallowing a thorned plant entirely to the dregs. And I think those are just sort of two things I wanted to introduce to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Regarding Hopepunk, we actually do have, first of all, we have a question. This is not a question about the talk, but Anastasia has a question about who is on Lyle's shirt.
Can I answer that at the end? After I promise I will answer it at the end.
Okay, great. In terms of Hopepunk, I was thinking as you were talking, one of my favorite games at the moment actually is Breath of the Wild, which takes place in a post-apocalyptic Hyrule, and yet our hero is our hero. He is resisting the this post-apocalyptic scenario, and his ultimate goal after he rebuilds his skills and rebuilds his memories and gains the help of others is ultimately to defeat the demonic force that has overtaken Hyrule, Ganon, okay, Calamity Ganon. So I was thinking in terms of I love the fact that you use those examples from scripture. The Acts of the Apostles as Hopepunk was really kind of an enlightening concept. But I'm actually kind of curious right now about where you were going with Guardians of the Galaxy, because you in brief, you don't have to read the whole section, but if you could tell us in brief where you were planning to go with that.
Well, that really, if you remember at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy, the resistance is in the dance, and not the violence. Star-Lord is to get the. See, it's been so long since I watched it. Now I can't remember what it's called, but he had to get the stone, one of the Infinity Stones, and to get it back, he starts dancing rather than trying to get into. He knows that he's not going to be able to overcome. See, it's been so long since I watched it, and now I've got all the Marvel movies in my head and all the enemies. But yeah, Ronan, thank you. He knows he can't overcome Ronan by force, and instead of going to that, he goes to his like dancing and kind of a silliness, and that there's resistance in humor and resistance in art, resistance in beauty. That these are other ways of resisting rather than violence. And so I went from the like we felt we needed a palate cleanser after Rogue One. So we had Guardians of the Galaxy, but that's kind of in a nutshell. Was resistance in other ways that weren't violent.
Okay, we have a question about Grimdark, actually. Why do you think Grimdark themed fiction is so common today when humans are wealthier and healthier and experience less violence than in the past?
So to some degree, you can trace the beginnings of Grimdark actually back to the early 80s, which was, on the whole, actually a fairly optimistic time. On the whole, we especially as an American culture, we had this view that we had defeated racism, that we were moving forward, that things were only going to get better, So Grimdark kind of came out of that. The actual term comes from Warhammer 40K, which had the tagline, "In the grim dark of the future, there is only war," right? And so in this time of increasing optimism, Grimdark was sort of a pushback against that. The reason why I think Grimdark has continued to have an upswing, and we see it through things like the Batman... The Dark Knight Returns and some of these other stories where they take these heroes and kind of reimagine them in a very kind of grim and gritty way, right? Part of the reason why we've seen an upswing in it since 2001 is that a lot of these grimdark stories are now being transformed from books and graphic novels into movies and television shows, and so we're seeing kind of a resurgence based around that. But some of the best grimdark stuff that's out there has been written since 2000, and in some ways I think it has to do with the fall of the Twin Towers, right, with 9/11, and sort of a shaking of the foundations. That optimism in a lot of ways kind of goes out the window in that moment, and America is forced over the next several years, and hopefully will continue to be forced to do so in the future, to do some soul searching and hopefully come out the better for it.
I would actually concur with what you said about the 80s, because this ethos, I think it manifests itself also in the punk movement of the 80s, which does go into darker and darker themes as pushback against the optimism that was prevalent in the dominant culture at the time. So this countercultural movement, kind of pushed out those visions instead. And we find actually some great post-apocalyptic things happening in the 80s in media as well. Okay, on the subject of weaponized hope, is the rising appetite for Hopepunk, do you also feel this is linked with a hunger for taking resulting behavioral and structural changes? I ask because I am also wondering whether you came across the term stubborn optimism, which Christina Figueres and Tom Rivet-Kamak coined in their book, The Future We Choose.
Okay, we did not come across that, but we are also, one of the things we first presented this 2 years ago, and we've changed in some of our thinking, and I think this is a evolving time, because there is a difference between hope and optimism, and we talk about here weaponizing optimism and resistance to this grimdark world, but sometimes optimism is, oh, let's look at the bright side of everything, and that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about hope as resistance to the grimdark that we see, and it's and so that's an area we're getting into. But no, we did not read that other book, and we did not come across that term. The weaponizing optimism, I believe, came from Alexandra Rowland's paper that we first read.
Okay.
Which I believe, if I remember correctly, is called One Atom of Justice, One Molecule of Mercy, and the Empire of Unsheathed Knives.
Tolkien talks about the long defeat, in that no victory is permanent because evil will always be a part of the world until the end. Heroes must still stoically fight while knowing any victory is temporary. Does that approach fit within the Hopepunk ethos?
I would say that approach fits. We've talked a lot about whether Tolkien would be Hopepunk. The figure of Frodo is Hopepunk, but Aragorn is Noble Bright, obviously, and that there's some other elements in there. But that is the approach. I mean, the article that just came out yesterday from Ada Palmer, which we have a Facebook page. It's Hopepunk Theology, and you can look us up, and I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But we just posted her article because she talks about how it may be something that we never achieve, but we still strive for it. And isn't that what we're doing here on Earth as Christians?
We don't actually have any other questions, but the comment that you made about Frodo versus Aragorn actually kind of makes me want to say a couple of things about Frodo's journey, if you don't mind. Frodo's journey, I mean, he gets the ring to Mount Doom and then cannot finish the job. You know, ultimately it's because, Gollum is there, that the ring is destroyed. And so I can see what you're saying about the Hopepunk. He goes on that journey, he gets all the way there. It's his heart that, he gets there. He resists Mordor as far as he can, but in the end, Mordor is overwhelming. So there needs to be more of a community, even if it's a community that includes this darker character. What are your thoughts?
I was thinking he couldn't get there without Sam, which is Sam is actually really the Hopepunk character, because he's the nobody thinks he's going to be the hero, and he's the one who comes along. But it also goes back to the earlier conversation. I mean, Frodo and Gollum are linked intrinsically forever, and it goes back to that. To what was happened, the conversation on mimetics. So there's a lot that we could go into there. I do realize we're getting close to time, and there's a couple more questions that came in. So
actually, there's a couple of questions for the other talk. First of all, there's a request, and that is that Anne and Lyle might make their text available so that we could read it in case we miss something. If that's possible. So that's a request that was made. And also the question is, where would be a good place to start in reading Balthazar?
Well, we're thinking of getting our texts published. So I'm gonna say no.
That's fine. But it will be available at some point.
Yes.
It will be available at some point, or will.
Yes. Lyle always recommends Mysterium Pascale for Balthazar, and I think that's right, particularly for what's sort of different about Balthazar. Yeah. if you want like a systematic explanation of things Balthazar's worried about, I did write a book, but Balthazar himself is, I think Mysterium Pascale works.
Okay.
I recommend Adam's book highly, very, very, very highly. Thea Poetic is a fantastic intro to exactly what he's concerned about and why he's concerned about it, why it matters to be concerned about theology and aesthetics together.
Thank you, Lyle.
Okay. I think we do have another question, but I think we've kind of run out of time for questions. It was another Grimdark question, and I'll see if I can copy this and put it in the chat. So I did copy it and put it in the chat. But we're going to be going now to breakouts, and we'd like to thank our speakers. That was a really fascinating session, and I really enjoyed both of those talks, and I hope everybody else did too. We are going to be going to breakouts. This was our last session for Doxacon. We also have Vespers, I believe, at 5 p.m. Is that correct? Yeah. So we have breakout sessions next, and then we will have Vespers at 5 p.m. Okay. So thank you for attending the session, and thank you to our speakers, and we'll see you around.
Oh, what was the shirt? Did he say?
Oh, what is your shirt?
The character is named Shoto Todoroki from the manga My Hero Academia, which is also a brilliant study in Hopepunk and Mimesis and all the kinds of things that we've been talking about this afternoon.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.